Welcome back to Sam Miller Science. Today we're talking about one of those topics that just always seems to reemerge every few months or every couple years in the health and fitness space, and that is the science of seed oils and the omega-6 to omega-3 ratio. This was recently brought on by an influencer's post on seed oils and really just a review of some of the randomized controlled trials that are out there and human evidence on seed oils. Now, I will sort of preface that the influencer shared it in a way that said, hey, these certainly aren't harmless for human health, but there are a lot of people who gravitate more towards what's called the naturalist fallacy, or the idea that just because something is, man-made, that it's worse for you. And so the arguments sort of ensued and go back and forth on social media. And at times this can make it more confusing for people when it comes to their health, because they don't necessarily know, okay, is this what's causing the harm? Is this something I should avoid? Is there really no problem at all? And so I wanted to create this content to kind of follow up a previous content piece that I created around seed oils and the omega-6 to omega-3 ratio, and how to think about this both as someone who is a health professional, but also as someone who eats every single day and has to make decisions about my own nutrition. And certainly if you're watching this, you probably care about your own health, fitness, and nutrition as well. So basically what the RCT showed that this particular individual shared is that, independent of other factors, when we kind of look at it as a randomized controlled trial, was that the seed oils weren't harmful to humans. And usually that was essentially, when they're doing these particular studies, right, they might substitute, let's say, a vegetable oil in place of a saturated fat, or they'll try to keep certain variables fairly consistent, and then they'll add a certain type of dietary fat in place of another. Now, we do have other types of research available as well, whether it be an observational study, epidemiological study, in vitro studies, and other types of data that's basically been sort of parsed out. And I'm also making sure that I'm kind of referencing what this person shared appropriately. So in terms of in vitro studies, right, maybe that's something on lipid oxidation and cell damage. But the problem with when you look at these individual topics in a vacuum, and if you're only looking at the randomized controlled trial for that particular ingredient, now that does help to isolate our variables, and that's one of the goals of a randomized controlled trial, is to test hypothesis. And we essentially have multiple different groups. And when we randomize something and we're able to run a controlled trial on it, we have better sort of isolation for our testing of that hypothesis and the variable in question, which in this case was seed oils. But with something like nutrition, our individual nutritional decisions don't exist in isolation of other health behaviors and other elements of our lifestyle. So what this particular individual shared is more along the lines of, okay, the main reason that seed oils are harmful is because they are in certain foods that are quite calorically dense. They're hypercaloric, or maybe it's, things, think of like if you were to go to a state fair, whether it's fried foods or certain things that are highly sort of packaged or processed. And when we're talking about seed oils, usually it's in reference to vegetable oils, things like canola, corn, soybean oil. And up until the early 2000s, what's super interesting is a lot of people actually accepted that replacing these polyunsaturated fatty acids in place of saturated fat was actually good for human health. But then everything kind of flipped back in the opposite direction in recent years, and then there was more of a movement towards animal food, saturated fat. This has been popularized both by the carnivore diet and the keto diet. And then, people started questioning the original war against saturated fats and some of these different man-made oils and things that have made their way into foods. And I would say these oils are oftentimes the most common cooking oils when we're looking at ingredients across the board. So basically the question in this post, and then what was sent to me in the Instagram DMs is, do you agree with this? What are your thoughts on this? What should people be doing? What's some practical advice for individuals, and how should we really be thinking about this? And I think in order to appropriately answer the question, I need to give some context and again, pull out of just that vacuum of one particular food ingredient and what is happening in terms of our diet as a whole. And people who tend to have more of these oils present in their diet, not only are they consuming more calories, and energy availability is an issue when it comes to their metabolic health, but what are the types of foods you're consuming and where are you getting your food from if these things are sneaking into your diet a lot? Because typically it's going to come from going out to eat, which I think, can be done in a reasonable fashion without it becoming a huge issue. But people who are doing that all the time for every meal, not preparing a ton of food at home, people who are maybe opting for those more calorie dense choices or prepackaged foods or things with a very long ingredient list versus our single ingredient whole foods. Now, some would argue that's more of a naturalist fallacy, but if we think about the compound decision making of consistently opting for those foods, they probably tend to have more calories, tend to have less macronutrients, and less fiber or ingredients in the whole food matrix with the things like antioxidants, polyphenols, flavonoids, and different things that are playing into human health. So for some history, because I think we've kind of gone to both ends of this extreme, and if you think of it like the scales of justice, we've tipped, one way. First it was like all polyunsaturated fats, get rid of your saturated fats, and then on the other side, people who are very pro-saturated fat, from consuming more of an animal-based eating style. And so I want to just unpack all of this for a second. What we need to remember is between 1935 and 1939, the ratio of omega-6 to omega-3 in the diet was approximately 8.4 to 1. Between 1985, the ratio was 10.3 to 1, even as high as 12.4 to 1 in some other calculations. Now, between 2001 and 2011, the average ratio of omega-6 to omega-3 was 15 to 1. And today, Western diet styles, the estimated average ratio is going to be closer to an astronomical 20 to 1. So when we think about seed oils in general, the reason this can be confusing for people, and I think when folks are arguing on the internet, we're sort of missing the point here, is we shouldn't necessarily just be going out of our way to look for a reason to add more omega-6 to a diet that already in most Western populations is a pretty significant and prevalent part of the diet without even intentionally trying to consume more of it. So my first part of my kind of stance here is let's look at the trend that's happened over time and then parallels in terms of what's going on with our rates of cardiovascular disease, obesity, and autoimmune disease. When we see that omega-6 to 3 ratio change over time, it certainly isn't doing us any favors. Now, there are other variables and other things at play in our environment in terms of our movement, other things that are contributing to what's going on with human health. But I think when we know that we have different research on omega-6 to omega-3 ratio, we have an ample amount of research on the Mediterranean diet, and that was very centered upon fatty acid ratios, that while there may be seed oil research that shows that it's not inherently harmful in isolation, that doesn't mean that we want to go out of our way to consume more of it, nor should it be a cornerstone ingredient in your foods. So, and I think we have to remember why certain people post what they post on the internet, right? So this particular tweet or share was largely because people go in the opposite direction and fearmonger around certain foods and create essentially more or less a state of fear about certain food ingredients. And so on the other side, people feel like they need to play devil's advocate and stand up for those foods or basically get people to not fear certain food ingredients. And then people on the other side are like, what the heck, man, like this isn't exactly great for human health. Why are you recommending this food? But if you actually sort of read between you both read the actual comments, the full caption, responses to comments on social media, and then you also look a little bit further beyond the first post of a carousel, and you see really where people stand on this particular thing, which is, hey, these are not harmless, but the reason that people think that they're detrimental to human health exists for different reasons across a spectrum. So if you take folks who come from more of a strict calories in, calories out, macronutrition, if it fits your macro background, the argument is the main thing that seed oils are contributing here is an increase in density of calories at a given meal, maybe contributing to the hyperpalatable nature of certain food choices and leading to an overconsumption. And when we have that overconsumption and increased energy intake, that's leading to things like insulin resistance, metabolic syndrome, and chronic, essentially dealing with low-grade inflammation all the time from people's increased adiposity, low levels of muscle mass, so on and so forth, and speaking to the nature of the issues in terms of our Western society, more or less, because we look at other societies, it's not maybe as much of a problem. Now, there are, on the other side, right, we have people who are more proponents of eating things that occur naturally that are not man-made per se, or you have people who are proponent of animal foods, saturated fats, and then maybe there's a middle ground where it's like people who will consume a little bit of it, but really it's not intentionally going out of their way to consume it, and they'd rather consume more Mediterranean diet foods. Think like your olive oils, your fish, your animal fats, your whole eggs, your nuts and seeds. That's maybe where they're trying to get their dietary fats from. Now remember, omega-6 polyunsaturated fatty acids have two proposed mechanisms of being inflammatory, and that's either the oxidation, either in the oil form prior to consumption, and or oxidation within the body, and then also the ability of polyunsaturated omega-6 fatty acids to be converted to pro-inflammatory mediators as well. So the latter concern could be balanced out if we were to increase our intake of omega-3 in the diet. So if you were to look at these different arguments, and if you're watching on video, you can kind of see what I'm doing with my hands, but if you're listening to the audio, think of this on a spectrum, right? People who think there's no real problem to it as long as you control for calories and energy availability, which is definitely a paramount consideration when it comes to human health. If you overconsume food and we can't pull that energy through the system, and we end up with insulin resistance, inflammation, we know that we're headed towards some metabolic issues. So we know that that's a problem, but there's still potentially maybe some other problems at play too. So then we have the middle ground individuals who maybe it's like if it sneaks into some of their foods, they're consuming it, and then you maybe have foods on the other end of this. You have folks on the other end of the food spectrum where it's like I'm only consuming grass-fed beef, butter, tallow, whole eggs. Maybe they're having some olive oil or something here and there. Maybe also some fats from certain plant foods, maybe avocado, coconut, etc. And so then there's like kind of a middle ground between these two. And then what we can do is zoom out between these arguments happening on social media and see, okay, what other areas of research are related to this research and might be beneficial for someone to look at when making decisions about their health. And so we have not only the omega-6 research itself we have the polyunsaturated fat research on seed oils themselves, where people are making kind of the argument here, right, on randomized control trials, is that there's a neutral or positive effect on inflammation. Person picked two studies here to reference with the PubMed IDs, and then neutral or positive effect on heart disease with the PubMed IDs, and then neutral or improved insulin sensitivity and visceral fat, and then also some markers of insulin resistance. And this is when one of the PubMed IDs was comparing it to saturated fat and things of that nature. And then essentially they're going on and on about cancer studies and other things going on with that. Now, I do think what would be some other areas of research we might want to look at when people are considering the seed oil conversation? One might be, well, what do we see when, let's say, calories are controlled and we had the opportunity to increase our omega-3 intake in the diet, or we had the opportunity to increase monounsaturated fat intake in the diet? Because nutrition isn't like this light switch yes or no thing, right? It exists as certain foods that we may choose, unless we're just eating all of these foods, in which case we're definitely going to run into issues with energy availability. But a diet exists on a continuum of we potentially substitute certain foods for other foods. I may not need multiple cooking oils at a given meal. So if I use avocado oil or coconut oil, I'm probably not going to need canola oil, right? This substitution exists across meals, like multiple meals per day, dozens of meals per week, and then countless meals per year, and then even more, thousands and thousands and thousands, if not more, meals across your lifetime. So we need to remember this is not occurring in a vacuum. So if I have the opportunity to substitute a different oil, I may just jump at the chance to do that, right? Because this is when we look at this opportunity, okay, could I potentially substitute a monounsaturated fat? And then if we use the information from a Mediterranean diet study or omega-6 to omega-3 ratio study, maybe we feel a little bit better hedging our bets or understanding that might be the better choice, because nutrition exists in this spectrum of making relatively better choices compounded over a very long time horizon is what enables people to manage their weight, manage their appetite, manage their health markers, and ideally, if they're eating, to support activity levels, eating in a way that supports recovery from the movement that they're doing, whether that's resistance training or another type of activity or sport. So we can't look at, even though things like RCTs are helpful, we're using that evidence, that human evidence and human research, to combine it with evidence from other study areas and subject matters related to nutrition, actual studies conducted in the field of nutrition related to the seed oil research, what works best for that given person and foods they enjoy and can adhere to over time, and then also maybe the experience that the health coach, health provider, nutrition coach, dietitian, trainer, whoever has, who may be working with someone in this given case. So the evidence base should be combined with a combination of the evidence on one topic, but also the evidence across the entire body of research for nutrition, right? So this is where we're looking both at macronutrient intake, but also what fats are composing my dietary fats in terms of my macronutrient intake, what carbs are composing my carbohydrate intake in terms of my macronutrients and my calories, and what proteins are comprising my total intake of daily protein. So when I look across this, right, it's like I wouldn't maybe go out of my way to consume seed oil when I have other research on omega-6 to omega-3s. I have observational research on seed oil, and I have some randomized control trials on the Mediterranean diet and other forms of eating, where the ratios of fatty acids and what we're seeing in terms of optimal human health are different than a very high consumption of omega-6. Does that mean that you can never potentially have a food that contains this ingredient? No. What it means is if I have the opportunity and I am grocery shopping, I have the opportunity to choose from an array of cooking oils and options. You can choose from an array of different snack foods or single ingredients that are going to contribute to a meal that I'm cooking or that I'm making. And so it's not that this is where the difference between research and coaching an actual human comes into play, and understanding people's personal preferences and what they like, and also steering them towards what we believe to be optimal for human health, not just, okay, this was neutral or didn't have negative effects. And some of these studies did have positive effects, but it's to what degree is something positive. And if we took that information around seed oils and we also combined it with some of the other information that's out there, we'd probably come to the conclusion that, okay, so even if the proposed main driver here is an increase in calories and energy availability, is there a food that at a similar level of caloric density and similar purpose of why I'm consuming the food, whether it's flavor or as a cooking oil, that I could derive more benefits from in terms of my nutrition?